Esteemed guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our second plenary titled Leaving No One Behind Evaluation for 2030. This session aims to frame the key points and themes of today's conference. It will explore the emerging findings of the imminent Human Development Report on Inequalities. Then a discussion will follow on the implications for evaluation while focusing on leaving no one behind. Please welcome our moderator for this session, Ms. Heather Bryant, the Section Chief of Capacity Development at the Independent Evaluation Office, UNDP. Presenting would be Mr. Pedro Conceição, the Director of the Human Development Report Office, UNDP, and along Mr. Dr. Ahmed, Deputy Minister at the Ministry of Planning, Monitoring and Administrative Reform. Ms. Sukai, Prom-Jackson, Chair and Inspector of the Joint Inspection Unit of the United Nations. Mr. Uitto, Director of the Independent Evaluation Office at the Global Environment Facility, and Mr. Indran Naidoo, Director of the Independent Evaluation Office at UNDP and ViceChair of the United Nations Evaluation Group. Thank you, and please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. It is truly an honor and a great pleasure to be up here today and moderating this session on Leaving No One Behind, Evaluation for 2020. Even though our Master of Ceremonies has just introduced the panelists, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about them so that you know who's up here and what their background is, as it may help you when you're formulating your questions at the second half of the session. Let me start with our conference partner and host, Dr. Ahmed, who is the Deputy Minister to the Minister of Planning, Monitoring and Administrative Reform here in Egypt. Many of you already know him, but for those of you who don't, he has extensive experience in academic and international affairs and the private and public sectors. He has worked, among others, with the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C., the Economic Research Forum in Egypt, the World Bank in Washington, D.C., and the Egyptian Ministry of Investment. He was also the chief of the Economic Governance and Planning Section at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, so he is also part of our wider UN family. As I mentioned, currently he serves as Deputy Minister to the Minister of Planning, in addition to his work as a professor at the Economics Department of the American University in Cairo. His areas of research include business finance, growth theory, applied econometrics, economic development, and monetary and fiscal policies. Dr. Kameli has a PhD in economics from the University of Maryland at College Park. I would now like to pass to our key speaker today, Dr. Pedro Conceição, who has been since January 2019 the director of the UNDP Human Development Report Office, and he is the lead author of the Human Development Report. Prior to this assignment, Pedro served in other strategic policy units within UNDP, and before that, he was director of the Office of Development Studies. Pedro has published on inequality, the economics of innovation and technological change, and development in multiple journals. He has also co-edited several books and has been an assistant professor at the Technical University of Lisbon, Portugal, and has degrees in physics and economics and a PhD in public policy from the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. I would now like to turn once again to my left. It is a special pleasure to introduce Dr. Sukai Prom-Jackson. She is a Gambian national elected by the General Assembly to the Joint Inspection Unit of the United Nations system, of which she is the chair. At the UN Joint Inspection Unit, she has led 7 thematic system-wide reviews and evaluations and co-led or partnered in an additional 3 reviews and evaluations. Prior to joining the JIU, Sukai had already over 25 years of senior-level professional experience and leadership in scientific research and evaluation, policy formulation and strategic planning, program and project development, and in organizational and individual learning. She has worked in various capacities for the UNDP Independent Evaluation Office, the World Bank, United States federal and state government offices of research and evaluation, universities, research centers, and management consulting firms, and the Gambia government. She's a graduate of Howard University, Washington, D.C. on policy research, measurement, evaluation, and cognitive and behavioral sciences. Let me turn to the end of the row here. Dr. Juha Uitto is the director of the Independent Evaluation Office of the Global Environment Facility. He came to that position from being the deputy director of the IEO of UNDP, and prior to that, he worked as an evaluation advisor in UNDP and as a senior monitoring and evaluation coordination specialist with the Global Environment Facility since 1999. Dr. Uitto has conducted and managed programmatic and thematic evaluations of international cooperation at the global, regional, and country levels, in particular related to environmental management and poverty-environment linkages. He spent the 1990s with the United Nations University, coordinating the university's environment and sustainable development research and training programs. He was educated at the universities of Helsinki and Lund and holds a PhD in social and economic geography and is also a prolific author. And last but not least, Dr. Indran Naidoo, the director of the UNDP Independent Evaluation Office. Indran has over 2 decades of experience in leadership positions focused on advancing the use of evidence in decision-making nationally and internationally. As the head of the UNDP Independent Evaluation Office since 2012, Indran has led a pivotal and comprehensive reform to UNDP's evaluation function, reforming its governance to secure full independence, including direct reporting to the UNDP Executive Board. Indran's perspective at UNDP is grounded in his experience as a senior public servant in the South African government, where he successfully elevated the profile and the importance of evaluation as a key accountability and learning tool in government. Indran has been very active in the evaluation community as author, editor, commentator, keynote speaker, and chair of multiple national and international journals, forums, conferences, and events. He is also the vice chair of the United Nations Evaluation Group. So once again, I would like to thank all of the distinguished panelists for joining me today. It is truly an honor to be with you. Now let me introduce the session a little bit more. As you know, the theme of this 6th National Evaluation Capacities, or NEC, conference is Leaving No One Behind, Evaluation for 2030. Leaving no one behind is the central transformative promise of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and its Sustainable Development Goals. It represents the unequivocal commitment of all UN member states to eradicate poverty in all its forms, end discrimination and exclusion, and reduce the inequalities and vulnerabilities that leave people behind and undermine the potential of individuals and of humanity as a whole. Ever since the international community endorsed the SDGs, a key question for many has been, how do we know if we're achieving these goals? And this naturally translates into questions and debates about choices and definitions of indicators and targets, as well as the availability of data to measure progress against those indicators. A related question is, how do we know if we're leaving anyone behind? This leads to issues of availability of appropriate disaggregated data and the ability to measure inequalities. However, this alone is not enough. We want to know more. We also want to know, how do we reach the Sustainable Development Goals? How do we ensure that we are reaching the furthest behind first? What if the data suggests we are not reaching the poorest? We are not reducing inequalities? What needs to change? That brings us to the need for evaluation, to the systematic inquiry into what works, why, under what circumstances, where, and for whom. This session this morning is the beginning of a conversation that is intended to continue throughout the next 3 days. What is the role of evaluation in ensuring that no one is left behind? How do we ensure the evaluations we commission, the evaluations we design, the evaluations we conduct, leave no one behind? To begin this conversation, we will start with a presentation by Pedro Conceição on the emerging findings of the soon-to-be-published Human Development Report on Inequalities in Human Development in the 21st Century. After this update on inequalities in human development, we will then turn to the other members of our distinguished panel of economists, geographers, and evaluators to explore the implications of the findings of this new report for evaluation practice. And after an initial conversation with our panelists, we'll widen the discussion and open the questions to you, our participants. Without any further ado, Pedro?
Thank you, Heather, for introducing the panel, and my thanks also to Indran for inviting me to share with you some of the findings of the forthcoming Human Development Report. And Dr. Kamali, thank you for hosting us. This is really a wonderful venue, and it's very impressive. Thank you. The report this year, the Human Development Report, covers the topic of inequalities in human development. And as I will try to argue, there are a number of connections between the findings of our report, of which I will present a preview, and the theme of the conference, the theme of leaving no one behind. Before I come to the findings of this year's report, I want to say just a few words about human development reports in general. And after presenting some of the findings of the report, I will also share some more personal reflections about the challenge of leaving no one behind, which is a central pledge of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, for evaluation, in part informed by the work that we've done in the Human Development Report. So human development reports may be familiar to many of you. We started as UNDP to publish them in 1990. And they've covered a number of topics, as you see listed on this slide. But the common theme in all of the reports is that the central tenet of development is to improve people's lives. So it's an effort to have a people-centered approach to development, one in which the goal is not simply to increase income, but actually to understand how people's lives are being improved. And in addition to choosing on a theme in every report, as you may also be aware, we publish a number of indices. Perhaps the most well-known of those that we publish is the Human Development Index, which tries to combine measures of progress that are related to income with other elements that are important for human development, namely health and education outcomes. And it's quite remarkable to see the wide range of impact that the HDI has, ranging from policymakers at the highest level of governments, all the way to people on the street that speak and engage with the rankings and the indices, as well as the private sector. Sometimes we see people in the financial sector, for instance, relying on the Human Development Index, on the HDI, to help to inform some of the work they do. So, with this general introduction about HDRs, let me now turn to the topic of the report this year, which, as was mentioned, is about inequalities in human development. Why did we choose this topic? In large measure because there is a call from the public at large for greater equality. And you see an illustration based on public opinion surveys on this slide. Each dot represents a country, and it shows the evolution of the number of people that are asking for more equality in answering these public opinion surveys. So the blue dots represent an increase in the number of people asking for more equality from the first to the second decade of the 21st century. And you see that there are a number of countries that are asking for more inequality. The public is asking for more equality, and also that this cuts across the political spectrum. It's not tied only to one political leaning. And so this suggests to us that there is something going on around the world through which people are concerned about inequality. And in a way, this may be a little bit surprising, because we all know that there's been tremendous progress on the Human Development Index, as we been documented over the last few reports, in reductions in the headcount poverty rate. We heard our Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations mention all of the progress that has occurred. And so this is the premise of the report, is why do we see this disconnect between, on the one hand, people asking for more equality, and on the other hand, people recognizing that there has been progress on a number of fronts. And so our hypothesis is that there might be three reasons why we see this greater interest on equality. One, perhaps people are interested not only in understanding what happens when it comes to inequality in resources, in income, but in other dimensions. And so one of the things we do in the report is going beyond income. Another reason may be because the measures that we rely on to account for inequality are, in a way, averages that hide behind them complex dynamics that people are concerned about. So we want, in this report, to go beyond averages. And then thirdly, perhaps because people are less worried about or less concerned or considering less what has happened in the past and more worried about what's going to happen in the future. And so we try to understand what's happening or it's likely to happen when it comes to inequalities in human development beyond today. So this approach, beyond income, beyond averages, beyond today, provides the framing for the report this year. And what I will do now is to share some of our findings in each of these three dimensions. And I will focus more, as you will see, on the part that relates to beyond average, because I think it might be the one that's more relevant for the discussions during the conference. So on beyond income, we have a very simple message. The message is that when we look at the range of human development, the language that we use in human development framework is capabilities, meaning what's important for people to lead the lives in a way they value, we see two trends. We see, on the one hand, that there is narrowing of inequalities in what we call basic achievements. So this relates to the progress that has occurred on the headcount poverty rate, extreme poverty rate, child mortality, improvements in enrollments in primary education. So all of these are dimensions in which there is a narrowing. But at the same time, we document gaps opening up in new dimensions of human development. These new dimensions of human development we argue, are likely to be more empowering and more important for people over the course of the 21st century. So this, in a way, is a way of illustration that anxiety that many people feel about the inequalities that are emerging, that are not only linked to income, but into many other aspects of life. Let me now move to, I'm hesitating because I lost the slides here, but I can see them there. Let me now move to the second bit on which I want to spend a little bit more time, beyond averages. So, as you may know, one of the ways in which inequality in income is typically described is by relying on summary measures of inequality. Typically the Gini coefficient, which goes from 0 to 1, 0 being perfect equality, 1 being all the income in a society is owned by a single individual. Now, you see on this slide what's called a growth incidence curve that plots population, in this case of Brazil, from the poorest to the richest individual, and then maps the increase or decrease in income over a period, in this case over this century essentially, from the beginning of the century until now. So everything that is above it's positive means increase in income, and of course the higher the level, the higher the percentage of income increase for that particular person or segment of the population. So what this graph shows is that there's been increase in the income of those at the top, not even the top 1%, but the top 0.1%. There's been also increase in incomes, those at the bottom. But you see here that there is a segment of the population that's actually been losing, has actually seen reductions in their level of income. I'm giving the example of Brazil because it's a country, like several others in Latin America, in which there's actually been a decrease in inequality as measured by the Gini coefficient that has been quite well documented and studied. But by looking beyond this summary measure to a picture like this, we immediately understand how different people will have different perceptions about what's happening when it comes to inequality. And this is the power and the value of going beyond averages. And relating this to the leaving no one behind theme of the conference, you see immediately that there's a group of people in this society that are actually being left behind. Perhaps not those at the very bottom, but a group of the population that nonetheless is being left behind compared to the rest of society. Thank you. Another dimension that we look at when we go beyond averages is gender equality. Once again, this is one of the areas in which the 2030 Agenda calls for availability of disaggregation of data. And in many cases, we hide behind this average in which we don't distinction between what happens across different genders. And we are all aware of the sharp inequalities that exist when it comes to gender. But what is relatively new in the report, we believe, is that we are able to document something that we call a backlash when it comes to social norms in support of gender equality. As the slide shows, we see once again, based on results from public opinion surveys, that there is an increase across both men and women in biases against women over the last few years. This has happened in different ways in different countries, but on average, it's a trend that seems to be emerging. And our interpretation of this trend is that as women become closer to making progress on more empowering areas, then societies react with this backlash. So for instance, it relates to the message that I alluded to earlier when it comes to the analysis that we did beyond income. When it comes to more basic achievements, more basic dimensions of gender equality, progress is rapid and in many cases we already have gender equality. But as progress starts to hit on power, that's where societies sometimes have this backlash. So once again, this is another dimension of aspects of in which people are being left behind. In this case, women are being left behind, in a way as a result or as a reaction to some of the progress that has been made. Another dimension that we look at in this analysis beyond averages is to try to understand to those that have not made it above the line of moving beyond headcount poverty. So the question is, even those that have not moved above the line, are they making progress? Are they getting closer to the line? Or are they getting stuck at the bottom? So the evidence seems to suggest that there are actually those that have not been able to move above the line are actually being stuck at the bottom. So you see on this graph the increase in the overall mean of consumption, which is the blue line, which has actually increased quite a lot in this century. This is a movement through which many people were pulled out of poverty. But those that are still living below the headcount poverty line, the poverty line, for those consumption has actually not budged. It stayed at the bottom. So this is another example of the importance of understanding what's happening to those that are living in poverty. Sometimes we characterize them as you know, a uniform group of people that are perhaps not moved above the line, but are making progress. Well, the evidence seems to suggest that that is not the case. And I think this is, I'll come back to this at the end, I think this is one of the most important challenges that we face when it comes to fulfilling the pledge of leaving no one behind. How do we address the furthest behind that seems to be stuck at the bottom? The final example that I will give to illustrate the analysis that we do on going beyond averages is to look at differences in progress on reductions in child mortality across different segments of the population. So I mentioned earlier that there's been rapid progress in reductions in child mortality. And this is illustrated in this graph by the red line, which shows the progress that has occurred when it comes to child mortality, the average progress. But you see the blue line shows the progress for the top 20% of the population. And you see that for those, actually, projecting forward, they may actually hit the target, the SDG target on child mortality. That is not likely to happen on average, and it's certainly not likely to happen, as the yellow line shows, for the poorest 20%. So once again, this shows the importance of moving beyond average and thinking about the rates of convergence, not only of the average, but trying to understand different degrees of pace of convergence, in this case of child mortality, for different segments of the population. So again, to bring it to the leaving no one behind discussion, the bottom 20% of the population, when it comes to child mortality, is actually not making that much progress compared to the richer segment of the population. So I'll move now briefly to the third part, Beyond Today, which links also to some of the policy recommendations emerging from the report. I will be a little bit quicker on this last bit. And I'll start by saying that as we think about policy recommendations and Beyond Today, we try to explore some of the important drivers or trends that are likely to shape the evolution of inequalities in human development over the course of the 21st century. Of course, many things will certainly have a bearing on inequalities in the 21st century, but we chose to highlight two in particular. One, climate change, and the second one, technological change or technological progress. So when it comes to climate change, we do know that climate change has asymmetric impacts across countries and across segments of the population. And it's actually likely to exacerbate inequalities that already exist. So an illustration is provided in this slide that looks at the evolution of cross-country inequality. And the thick line shows that cross-country inequality has actually been going down. The shaded part in gray shows the impact of simulations of what would have happened had climate change not existed. And what you can see is that the rate of progress could have been actually much, much faster. So projecting forward, the evidence seems to suggest that climate change is likely to exacerbate inequalities. And in the report, we explore also the extent to which existing inequalities and the evolution of inequalities may also have a bearing on our ability to address climate change through a number of channels. On technology, the evidence is very clear that there has been a very sharp reduction in the price of some capital goods that have enabled many firms around the world to replace humans, to replace labor with capital. You see on the top the reduction in prices in communications and computers. So the ICT revolution has been one of the most important drivers of this shift that has occurred, that has led to a reduction in the labor share of income. So if you consider the total income of an economy, the amount that goes to capital and the amount that goes to labor, this balance over the years has been rather stable. But recently, we've seen a decrease in the share of labor income. So technology has been, in a way, already driving some important inequalities, perhaps not on its own, interacting with other factors like trade, and the spatial dimensions is also very important, but is certainly associated with some of the changes that we're seeing in the distribution of income in our economies and societies. So projecting forward, the question is whether this is likely to be exacerbated as new technologies come online linked to artificial intelligence, more powerful forms of automation, or whether there is a possibility of shaping the direction of technological change in ways that doesn't replace labor but actually reinstate demand for labor. And we make the case that this is indeed possible, and it's one of the important messages that we have in the report, that we should not take the direction of technological change as something that is given exogenously and that is completely unrelated to the societies that we do in our economies and in our societies. So, policy recommendations, and I'll be very brief. The discussion on how to redress certainly income and wealth inequalities typically dominated by redistribution, efforts to redistribute income and wealth primarily through taxes and transfers. And this can indeed be a very powerful driver of reductions in inequalities. So this chart shows what happens to market-determined inequality, the two bars on the left, and what happens to inequality after taxes and transfers, so after the effect of fiscal redistribution. And you see that the Gini coefficient, which is the measure that is used in this chart, in developed and developing countries is approximately the same. It's about 0.5, but after redistribution, it drops quite significantly, especially for developed countries, by as much as 16 or 17 points. Less so for developing countries, which suggests that certainly there's a lot of room for redistribution to play a role in mitigating the inequality in market incomes. But while recognizing that this is important, and again, staying with the spirit of going beyond income in our analysis, we make the point that we should not look at redistribution as the only tool to address inequalities in human development. And in fact, that we need to think about interventions that happen throughout the life cycle of people. Many of the determinants of income when people enter into the labor force have accumulated over their life cycles. Sometimes they start at birth or even before birth. So we're making the point that while redistribution is important, they should be seen in the context of a broader set of policies that address several dimensions of the drivers or the factors behind accumulation of inequalities in human development. So let me conclude with some couple of reflections on the challenge of leaving no one behind. So I hope I was able to show that leaving no one behind is a challenge that is manifest in many different ways. That in our societies, many people are either objectively being left behind or somehow feel that they are left behind. And so it's a challenge that calls on us to draw on the power of evaluation to learn and to have this more comprehensive approach on how to address the challenge of leaving no one behind. So this was the first message that I wanted to leave with you. And one thing that might be helpful in that regard is to consider a framework that UNDP has developed to try to understand how to operationalize the concept. And it's represented by these 5 circles that try to identify the different dimensions through which people can be left behind. So discrimination can be a factor. Certainly, it appears to be playing a role when it comes to the dynamics of gender equality that I described. Sometimes it's just the way in which economies seem to be working, related to technology, related to trade. Some segments of the population are somehow left behind. So that has to do more with socioeconomic status and so on. The second message that I wanted to leave with you is an appeal perhaps to try to mobilize evidence and to help us to learn how to reach the furthest behind. So not so much about the leaving no one behind as a whole framework, but how to reach the furthest behind. Remember the chart I showed, many seem to be stuck at the bottom. And it's easy to understand these are the people that are perhaps more difficult to reach, and also those for which the marginal impact of effort is actually going to be much smaller compared to the marginal impact of effort on people that are perhaps closer to the line already. And so sometimes in our business, in development, we have a pressure for results, and in that pressure for results, we tend to use our resources in a way that maximizes the marginal effort. But by doing that, we have to consider whether that kind of incentive is not leading us to get these people stuck at the bottom. So I would conclude with this appeal to all of you that during the rest of the conference and in years to come, we mobilize the power of evaluation to enable us to learn how we can effectively reach the furthest behind so that we fulfill the pledge to leave no one behind of the 2030 Agenda. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro, for this fascinating introduction and as well as reminder of what human development is about, going beyond income and now going beyond averages and importantly going beyond today. For reminding us that now when we're trying to understand equalities and inequalities and differences in perceptions, different people may be experiencing the same phenomena in different ways. Pedro has pointed out the phenomena of backlash, which is not something new but important to come back to. The points about the furthest being stuck at the bottom, this is where the data is quite interesting because it really shows us what we already intuitively know, that the furthest behind tend to remain furthest behind. He's also challenged us on our thinking in terms of leaving no one behind. This manifests itself in many ways, in many dimensions, and so we need to have a holistic approach to our development thinking, programming, as well as evaluation. And finally, he's called on us to continue to mobilize evidence. I think that'll be another message throughout the conference, to really understand how do we reach the furthest behind. So now I'd like to invite our panelists to share some of their reflections. I'm going to start off by asking them a few questions, which they may or may not answer, but give them an opportunity to reflect on what Pedro has said as well. I'd like to start with Dr. Kamali. As we know, Pedro has described the report and this emphasis on going beyond income, beyond averages, and beyond today. In the Egyptian context, what does it mean to go beyond income, beyond averages, and beyond today? And how is the Ministry for Planning, Monitoring, and Administrative Reform incorporating these issues into both monitoring and evaluation systems?
Thank you very much, Heather, for the question, and I think this is a very important question. Let me first start by thanking you. Thank you for being part of this distinguished panel, and it is hard for me definitely to comment after this excellent presentation by my friend Pedro, right? So, but I'll try my best. All right, so this is a very important question, I think. You cannot, this is better? You cannot, this is better? Okay. My mistake. I don't need to repeat what I said. I just said maybe the last thing that I said, that it's bit difficult to come after this insightful presentation by Pedro, but I'm going to do my best. And I'm very happy to be part of this very distinguished panel. Now, let me talk a little bit about the Egyptian experience, given the question of Heather. Definitely, in Egypt, I think in the last 2 months, we had the results of the household budget surveys. And from this result, it indicates that poverty has increased in Egypt. This is, we always say in Egypt that poverty and inequality, these are phenomena of something more fundamental and more drastic that is happening. So in order to deal with inequality and poverty, i.e. the inequalities in terms, for example, of income, we have to look at the main reasons behind these phenomena. And this is actually what we are doing in Egypt. We try to design our policy based on evidence-based policy to see what is the things that the 2030 as a transformative agenda. It means that we need to look at the reasons why people are poor, why there is this discrepancies or big discrepancies in terms of the income between, for example, the people in the Delta, in the north of Egypt, and Upper Egypt. And one of the main reasons behind this is simply that there are some development gaps in this region. People go and try to, for example, work in Cairo, work and even outside Egypt, because they cannot find good job opportunities in their places. Now, in order to get job opportunities, you have to have the conducive environment for these job opportunities. You have to have good infrastructure. You have to have a good education. You have to have good health. And this is, and when we always think we want to think about inequality, not in terms of inequality in terms of income, inequality in terms of opportunities. So what the government of Egypt does and is trying to do now is to address these inequalities in terms of opportunities by trying to put more investment into these places that are, in a way, I cannot say suffering, but they have some problems in terms of development, in terms of that they don't have good, for example, system of sewage, they don't have good schools, they don't have good health systems. Now, if you address these sources of inequality, of poverty, you are inviting the private sector to come, you are inviting people to invest, to create job opportunities. By doing this, what you are doing is that you are dealing with the sources of poverty and inequality. And this is something that actually that we are doing in Egypt. This is very much associated with the idea of the localization of the SDG. And this is something that we are working with the UNDP on it. Now, the localization of SDG is something which is very, very important. We started by 5 governorates. Now, in the new phase, we're going to have all the governorates of Egypt. We want to see how each governorate is faring in terms of the indicators of the SDGs, to see what are the gaps in the development in order to address them, right? And this is the things that we are doing. This does not mean that these are kind of, if you think about these things, people would say, but this is a bit of a long-term perspective. Yes, it is a long-term perspective. And this is why we are complementing this with other programs, like for social protection. My Egyptian colleagues knows the Takaful and Karama. These are programs in order to aid the poor, in order to give some kind of assistance and subsidy to the poor. This is, and another thing which is very, very important is the idea of the targeting of the poor. Now, there is something which is, we looked at it and it looks a bit weird, and actually the president commented on this. If you look at the distribution of ration cards in Egypt, and if we divide the population into deciles, 10%, 10%, 10%, you're going to see that the people in the upper, right, in the highest 10%, highest decile, they are getting subsidy. They are having ration cards and are using ration cards. This is a targeted subsidy. If we want to have an effective system of subsidy, it has to be targeted, right? And this is why we're giving more to the needy, and you don't give subsidy to the people who do not need the subsidy. These are the things that we are doing in Egypt. These are the things that we are focusing on in order to go beyond the inequality in income and the inequality. We want to go into, we look at the inequality in terms, as I said, of opportunities. The last thing that I want to say is in terms of the gender, right? Now, in the last the Sustainable Development Summit, one of the things that the Secretary General talked about, that there is almost no country is going to achieve the targets or in terms of the gender. Now, this is a very important challenge in Egypt. Now, we have a participation rate of women that is quite low. It is less than 20%. We want in Egypt to improve this very much, because if you think about it, if you improve the participation rate of women, this is going to have a reflection on the GDP. This is going to have a reflection on equality and poverty as well. Now, in order to do this, this is why we have directed programs of SMEs and microfinance directed to women. And this is the way that we want to push this gender equality. And I will stop here, and I'm sorry that I took lots of time, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kamali. I think the audience will agree that there were some very inspiring thoughts in what you've shared about what you're doing here in Egypt, as well as recognizing some of the challenges that we're facing worldwide. Let me turn to Sukai now. Sukai, what are your thoughts on how evaluation should be or can be inequality sensitive? and the role evaluation can play in helping to ensure development policies and programs leave no one behind.
Heather, thank you for that question. Heather mentioned at the beginning that I work for the Joint Inspection Unit of the United Nations system. The JIU has oversight over the whole UN system. And if you will permit me, I want to put on my hat as an inspector for this one moment to make reference to what I am observing here today in 2019 and what was observed in 2009 when the UNDP Evaluation Office started the NEC conference. At that time, there were about 50 participants, and what we are witnessing is over 500 participants. So if we have to make a point about whether you're doing the right things or whether you're doing things right, I think the evidence itself, is quite obvious. And I think my colleague, Juha, who was also one of the initiators of the NEC, would agree to that. So congratulations. Inspectors, we don't usually say congratulations, but we will report to the member states of the success. So congratulations, Indra, and congratulations to the Evaluation Office, and congratulations to all the partners that are involved. Very quickly going to your question, Heather. It's a question about inequalities, and it's a question about the role of the evaluation profession, the practice, and the function. And I have to take a certain frame in answering that. I think we start by looking at inequality. It includes gender. We're talking about race. We talk about inequalities associated with age, inequalities associated with disabilities, whether they're physical disabilities or whether they're learning disabilities. There are various forms. So the point there is it's such a heavy agenda. And in looking at inequalities, the importance is to look at the intersection of the various forms of inequalities. And this is a very challenging thing to do, particularly in our evaluation function, where it's a lot easier for us to segment things and look at them separately. But I think if we're looking at the role of evaluation, a key challenge is how we bring the lens in looking at inequality. And part of it involves understanding histories of the various parties involved. As an African woman, the histories that I hold might be quite different from the histories of other women who might be white or of Arab origin. So I think we do have to really consider, when we say inequalities, that as evaluators, we don't jump on the bandwagon, but be clear about what we're saying. I want to look at the question that you have from the point of view of evaluation and the transformative role it plays. I don't have specific answers to some of the details of what you're talking about, Heather. But I'd like to take the angle, since we are here as evaluators, as well as stakeholders of the evaluation function, to really take a look at what if the role of evaluation in our current times and in addressing the imperatives of our current times and imperatives of the 2030 agenda. It's an imperative for transformation. Transformation is a different kind of change. It's not developmental, where we want to just improve. It's not transitional, where we think we know where we want to go and we can pretty much address it. Transformational typically means we have an idea, we have a vision, we're not really sure about it. The knowledge systems we have no longer actually qualify in how we actually address these problems. Transformation requires a certain mindset, a holistic view, And I think that was referred to earlier in the comments made. So I think what we're looking at, when we look at the role of evaluation in our current times, it's how it's addressing those imperatives, one of them being inclusion. And that's exactly what we're talking about here. There are other imperatives which, in just looking at inclusion, we actually fail to also address those. And I think you know what those imperatives are from the 2030 agenda, dealing with a world that, number one, is volatile, it's unpredictable, it has constant change, it is constant adaptation, and change is very fast. I was actually talking to one of our colleagues, and we were talking about our heavy methods in evaluation and how we need to change some of that things change very fast, and how do we position ourselves with the media? How do we position ourselves with policy researchers? How do we position ourselves with the statisticians? It's a big challenge as everybody is trying to find answers. And the important thing, therefore, is how we as evaluations define what is our strategic niche, where it is we add value when we start looking at the levels of inequality. Now, I think for all of us, the important thing that is quite significant for us as evaluators is to know what our discipline is all about. And I want to reiterate those because as we look at inclusion, as we look at the other imperatives of fast change, the large scope of the reforms and the multiple players, I think the important thing is to remember who are we as evaluators and what do we do and what are we bringing to the table. We must understand what our comparative niche is. Otherwise, we will totally get lost. And I just want to mention, I went to a conference of auditors, and all the questions they're asking actually are the same evaluation questions. And I'm constantly asking them, so you are doing evaluations? And they said, no, we audit. But I said, no, you're asking the same sets of questions. Evaluation as a critical inquiry, it raises the questions. One, what are we doing? We never want to include that in evaluation because we assume we know and assume there's a structure. But now we don't. We have to start the first question, what are we doing? And the second question for evaluation, are we doing the right things? Are we doing things right? Are we making a difference? This is because our field is a field of critical inquiry. It is not a field that simply reports against point A and point B. So that mode of critical inquiry plays a major role in how we begin to look at inequalities. And as we begin to analyze what the interventions that are being done by various parties. I think that's important. The other one, I think, is our advantage as evaluators is to bring highly impartial knowledge. Indran mentioned independence structurally, but also how we carry out the work. I think that's something we should never lose sight of, but we must not be held captive to actually sticking to a level of independence that is not balanced with validity. Because a major function of what we do is to consider how valid what it is that we do. Validity has to deal with the accuracy, and if we are not accurate in what we say and what we do, tied to the judgments that we make, I think there's a big danger there. So balancing the moving forward with transformative evaluation as we look at no child left behind, the vast inequalities, leave no one behind, is the importance for us when we start looking at those to actually think with great accuracy on what it is we're talking about, to think with great accuracy on, in our profession, where we're privileged to make a judgment. How are we interpreting inequalities? How are we actually assessing them? How are we defining what is of value? And how are we making recommendations for policymakers and other decision makers and for accountability of what's done? I think you all know that. But the point I bring to this discussion is how do we frame what we do as a profession in moving forward? And I think the important message I'd like to bring, is that as we address the imperatives, that we really reflect on what is the value we're adding, what are we doing, what do we actually seek as a profession to add value to. Now, I think I want to mention that in the evaluation, we're basically looking at both, we say accountability. The accountability we look at is accountability for resources. I think it's well known how we focus so much on accounting for resources. We've lost sight of, in this case, accounting for the inequalities that we're discussing here. The second one is accounting for process. Now, those are not things we typically focus on, but it's very important we look at the inequalities and account for that as we report on, which we typically, up to now, I think has not been the favor, especially in our development cooperation, where we focus so much on the use of the resources. In that regard, I just want to make one point, so as not to belabor the point here, is when we look at inequalities, the same things we look at apply. The same criteria which you're debating include. When we look at how our partners are deciding what to address, we must interrogate the relevance of what's being done. We must look at how effective. We must look at what the impact or difference. I think in our current world of major transformative change, where we don't really know the answers, the important thing is also that in evaluation, we must look at the process. We must look at the integrity of the process that is being applied. We must look to see, how much the nature of what's being done is actually adequate or appropriate for what we're looking at, for addressing inequality, in its various forms. I think I'll stop there. There's some other points which I could follow up on. Thank you.
I think Sukai has given us food for thought for at least the next 6 NEC conferences. She's asked a lot of very important questions, and what I get out of that is the need for us as evaluators to constantly ask ourselves questions. It's not just asking programmers whether they're doing the right thing, but whether we ourselves as evaluators, what are we doing? Are we doing things right? And are we doing the right things? I think that's a key message. And we tend as evaluators to just ask those questions of the programs we're evaluating. But it's really a good point that we need to step back and ask ourselves. And I won't try to go into all of the rest, perhaps just picking up on the important point that when we're talking about inequalities, as Pedro had already mentioned, there's multiple dimensions, as did Dr. Kameli, that the intersectionalities are also extremely important to understand what we're trying to understand here. Let me turn briefly to Indran. Indran, the UNDP paper that Pedro referred to at the end of his presentation states that most development efforts today still stop at the end of the metaphorical paved road, failing to improve the lives of the poorest and the most disadvantaged, often citing the expense, the capacity, and time it requires. And I think Pedro also touched on this. What about evaluation efforts? Do evaluation efforts also tend to stop at the end of the paved road? How does UNDP ensure that its evaluations go beyond the beaten path?
Thank you very much, Heather, and thank you for the stimulating keynote and respondents probing in questions that, as Heather has mentioned, will be conversations for many decades to come. But the focus is directly on when does evaluation stop and when do evaluators stop? A key issue here would be how do we conduct the evaluations? Now, in the portfolio of the Independent Evaluation Office, most of our work is at the government level. So with the 100% coverage, we cover about 35 countries a year. We are evaluating the UNDP intervention at a country level. The evaluant is UNDP, the subject of evaluation. The government is the recipient of the service. And independently, we come up with what's called independent country program evaluations, this year for about a $7 billion portfolio that has findings, conclusions, and recommendations, which in the next cycle, a few years later, we can go and see what has changed. A key part of that would be, how do we debrief? Evaluation can sometimes become very technical, very bureaucratic, a tick box, and not engaging with the element of learning and follow-up. Because the belief is that once the evaluation is done, it's on the desk of the decision maker, the business is over, go away. You need to do your next evaluation. So we sort of wash our hands off that. But having the element of recommendations in the public domain and the management response, which all the independent evaluations of our office have, in the public domain, puts in a pressure and an obligation that in years to come, you will come back and check. In other words, the paved road, you will come back on that road and see what's changed. Because apart from us measuring impact, we need to measure, as Sukai has mentioned, what impact we have with the way we do our work. And that links to a conversation in this session around evaluation criteria. We tend to use criteria which is easy to measure, which is tangible, which is concrete, and on the basis of that, we assume it's scientific, impartial, and people should listen to us. But the truth of any development intervention, especially around SDGs, is that all of the elements are not easily measured. And when we measure, we don't know at what point we're measuring, and if we measure at the wrong point, have we caught success or failure? Because development is not a snapshot, it's a motion picture. If you walk in and it's a failure, you're likely to say, program failure, shut it. It may be that the program is still warming up. If you walk in and something is very positive, you'll think it's great and you'll say continue. It may be just a sporadic incident. So the point I'm coming to in Pedro's commentary, which is really about the geography of evaluation, the geography of evidence, there's an element of the spatial and the temporal. And when we're talking about upstream, what we do as evaluators, we test proposition. This is what the governments have said. We go and see whether it's happened, the downstream. There's an assumption that automatically upstream leads to downstream, downstream informs upstream. Honestly, if we really were to measure, we don't know. So the challenge we would have, I think, and the question I posed to the conference, is for us to not only reflect on SDGs, which has made us quite excited and energized 4 years ago, but use that as a frame for a more critical discourse in terms of whether we really are addressing inequality in all its dimensions, and whether the way we measure is accurate. Because it comes back to the point that has been mentioned by Dr. Kamali and as well as Sukai, the question of the science, the credibility, and the evidence. I do make an important point about independence because I believe it very strongly. Because I believe independence is what defines our profession. We make a judgment about past performance, we put truth on table, we deliberately cause anxiety and tension, because from there what should flow is a consideration of what should continue to happen. Our job is not to validate what we just think is there. It's really to question and to test everything. I'll stop at that. Thank you.
So as evaluators, our job is to continually question, and so I'm going to continue my questions, turning now to Juha, and I'm going to pick up on one thing that Indran said, the importance of both the spatial and the temporal. Pedro's last slide referred to this UNDP framework for understanding, leaving no one behind, and one of these key factors is geography. As geographers, we know that people are left behind and left open to vulnerability and inequity when denied social and economic opportunities, as Dr. Kamali was saying, denied human security and or quality public services simply based on their place of residence. In addition, contaminated or degraded natural resources can make it impossible for people to sustain their livelihoods or prevent natural disasters. So a first question to Juha would be, does geography matter for evaluation? And then I would ask him in answering to tell us a little bit about how the Independent Evaluation Office of the Global Environment Facility looks at these questions of inequality and leaving no one behind when they're evaluating their work, which is intended to tackle our planet's most pressing environmental problems.
Thank you, Heather. Does geography matter? Yes. It does, actually. It's very essential. And I've been very pleased with this panel that, that geography has been actually mentioned earlier as a fundamental thing. But what do we mean by geography? It's both physical and human geography. It is the actual topography. What is the lay of the land? Is it hilly or is it coastal or what is it? But it's also where people live, and there's a huge dimension of inequality in where people live actually. We know that in urban centers many settlements are unplanned, and people who come from the countryside and are maybe called illegal or informal settlements. So they tend to be on the slopes around the lands where other people don't want to live in. So, or they may be at the coastal zones and so on. So that renders people vulnerable. Often the poorest people are the most vulnerable when it comes to where they live actually. And it relates to their safety and so forth. As has been mentioned earlier, and as the SDGs are there, so everything is connected, everything is interconnected. The human environment, the natural environment is connected. Adaptation to climate change is really essentially about geography in many ways, I think. We are evaluators, and we are, most of us are some way social scientists and so forth. So we pay a lot of attention to issues such as social and economic factors in the Sustainable Development Goals, and into human rights, to gender, to inequality, and so forth, and that is correct. But if anything is left behind, we often leave behind the environment, the natural environment, actually. And by doing so, we leave behind a lot of humans, of people who are living in hazardous and disadvantaged environments. So that's very important. So let's take a concrete example, and Dr. Kamali and others know much better than I do, but Egypt. Egypt contributes about a little bit less than 1% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. But it is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world. And we know that there is the Nile Basin, which supplies something like 95% of the water resources for Egypt. It's a narrow strip in the middle of the desert. Little changes in climate will influence what happens to people's welfare. There are issues about water resources, there are issues about declining biodiversity, but then things even like vector-borne diseases. When we go up the delta to the Mediterranean coast, or I should downstream to the Mediterranean coast, we are having increasing floods now because of rising sea levels, and the city of Alexandria, I know, is facing severe flooding problems now. There's the big lakes, or the lagoons, Lake Burulus, Lake Manzala, others that are having significant ecological changes. And these are places where people actually depend on fisheries and other resources for livelihood. Okay, so we know this whole thing. In Egypt, I was doing some research here, and I know that the national strategy for adaptation and disaster risk reduction is closely related to the national strategy for development, and that's great. Okay, so what can evaluation do about this? How can evaluation incorporate these aspects? So I think one of the things is really the fundamental thing, that we have to understand where things happen, how it affects, how development activities, how environmental change, how everything affects people in different places. So in the Global Environment Facility Evaluation Office, we have been developing lots of methods for looking at environment-human interactions, these coupled environmental and human systems, through geospatial methodologies. We use satellite imagery, which helps us to take time series data, for example, on what has happened. You can see quite a lot from space, looking at how settlements are growing, how environment changes, how land use, land cover change, and so forth. So you can use that as a evaluative tool to actually see what are the actual changes. At the same time, so you need to, of course, understand why things are happening, and you don't necessarily see that from sky. As evaluators, we still have to rely quite a lot on the more traditional methods of actually talking to people and understanding what humans' motivations are, how they change the environment where they live in, and how the environment that they live in affects their lives. So we need mixed methods, and we need ground truthing at the same time. So for example, in one recent evaluation in the GEF, what we did was we looked at sustainable forest management in Uganda. We used satellite imagery to see what had happened, how the environmental changes had been taking place. Then we used night lights data, which is a very good proxy for economic activity, actually. Where do you have lights in the nighttime? It means that there are humans who are doing something, and it reflects also things like electricity and so on. And we correlated this with forest cover and things, and where GEF projects had been taking place. And then we combined it with household survey data from the World Bank, which was quite new. So when you take these kind of three sources of data and you go on the ground, you can actually use evaluative evidence to understand whether your projects and your programs are making some headway when it comes to both environmental improvement and socio-economic improvement. In this Uganda case, we could show that there was a correlation. Correlation, we know, doesn't mean causality, but we could show correlation between the sites where we had sustainable forest management programs and socio-economic development. So that's good enough in some ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juha, for sharing your thoughts. I think you've reiterated some of the questions that have come up from our other panelists, with the emphasis on the importance of where things happen and are things happening differently in different places, the importance of mixed methods for evaluation, and also for looking both at socio-economic and environmental improvements. And perhaps a challenge for most of us who do not work in the environmental area, I think we criticize our colleagues who work in the environment saying they don't think enough about the people. But I think a challenge to those of us working on the other side, we need to ensure that our evaluation of socioeconomic programs are also environmentally sensitive and that we're not leaving the planet behind. We are running behind schedule here. We were supposed to wrap up at 12:30, but we did have quite an adventure to get out to the group photo, so we got started a little bit late. And I would like to respect the engagement to engage with you as the participants. So I think we'd like to go just a few minutes longer. We can take a few questions, but I would ask you to be extremely brief and precise in your question. Try and keep your question to 1 minute, and then maybe we can keep the answers here to 2 minutes. And we'll just allow for a few questions so that we don't get too far off schedule, because I don't want to contribute to any human deprivation by limiting your access to food. Some colleagues who are supposed to help with running the mics. Maybe we can, let's be geographically equitable here. We've got one from this side of the room, one from here, and then we've got one in sort of the middle back there with I think it's the blue shirt. Can we get mics to these folks, please?
Mics?
Oh, you have to take our mics, okay.
You can take our mic.
Yeah. There was a gentleman over here, yes, with the, and then there was the lady here, and then there was the blue t-shirt. I think, well, let's start with those three. So this gentleman here. Oh, and kindly indicate to whom you would like to address your question. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Martin Berger. I work with UN Habitat Agency in Nairobi, Kenya. My question is the whole panel, in fact. And it is a simple question. Do you think we have been doing evaluation badly? Because the SDGs came up with when we had all these challenges, inequalities, exclusion, all these they have mentioned. And knowledge from evaluation and researches are still indicating the movement progress is still low. We are still with these problems. So are we doing evaluation very well or very badly? Because in the midst of evaluations, we still have these challenges. I think, to me, there is a disconnect. We should use, and evaluation would be very useful if it is to influence decisions and bring up solutions to feed into development.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Heba Gamal-Eddin. I'm assistant professor at the Institute of National Planning in Egypt. My question for Dr. Pedro. You talk about income redistribution. I need to hear more about some successful policies about these tools, especially in Egypt. We had something like that in the 1950s. However, it's completely different, especially in market economy. And at your presentation, you gave us some examples from different experiences like Brazil, like Iran. So I need some successful policies that we can adapt. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Anna Ivanovska, coming from North Macedonia. I would like to address a question to the last speaker. Could you provide us good example, best practices, or some champions when it comes to practical projects or example where there are mitigating the climate changes and reflecting of the most vulnerable, leaving no one behind? Thank you.
Okay, one more. The gentleman in the blue shirt, kindly raise your hand again so she can find you.
Okay. Je pose d'abord une question. Pour bien poser ma question, est-ce que je peux parler en français?
Oh. Parlez lentement.
D'accord. Alors, je suis François Bourouno de la Guinée-Conakry. Je suis évaluateur indépendant. J'adresse ma question à M. Pedro et au président du bureau indépendant de l'évaluation. Alors, par rapport à qu'est-ce qu'on doit faire pour ne pas laisser les gens derrière, j'ai 3 cas. Un premier cas sur des populations autochtones en Afrique centrale, où il y a eu une intervention qui visait à leur fournir des services de prise en charge, notamment des bâtiments d'habitation. Mais il se trouve que ces autochtones ne voulaient pas habiter dans ces bâtiments, alors que ces bâtiments avaient été construits. C'est au courant de l'évaluation que cela fut relevé. Et l'autre exemple, c'est par rapport aux personnes handicapées. Une évaluation pour l'intégration des personnes handicapées dans le programme national de lutte contre le sida. Mais il se trouvait qu'il y avait des albinos qui font partie des handicapés. Mais dans l'évaluation, ils disent de ne pas les appeler des handicapés, qu'ils n'ont pas d'handicap. Donc l'albinisme n'est pas un handicap. Et le troisième exemple, c'est sur les violences basées sur le genre. Le plus souvent, vous avez des jeunes, en Afrique surtout, qui sont victimes de violences sexuelles. Mais vous venez les interviewer, ils refusent de parler. Parce que pour eux, expliquer que j'ai été victime de violences sexistes, c'est exposer sa vie. Donc c'est une façon encore de s'exposer davantage à la stigmatisation. Donc ce sont des réalités qu'on rencontre dans l'évaluation. C'est de voir comment les réponses peuvent davantage être mobilisées pour que ceux qui sont estimés être laissés pour compte puissent davantage être intégrés dans des programmes, mais tout en ayant leur acceptation d'être dans les programmes. Et la deuxième question, c'est avec M. Pedro, comme je le disais, c'est par rapport aux données sur la baisse du taux de mortalité infantile. Ce serait important de nuancer parce que nous, on travaillait récemment sur l'indice du capital humain de la Banque mondiale. Dans l'analyse, il y a beaucoup de pays où la marge de progression n'est pas significative. Et il y a d'ailleurs des inquiétudes si, à l'horizon 2030, on atteindra les objectifs relatifs à la baisse du taux de mortalité infanto-juvénile. Merci.
We'll never have time to eat if we take more questions now, but I'm sure the panelists would be happy to meet with you afterwards. In terms of the last question, je suis désolée, je ne suis pas sûre d'avoir tout compris, but it related to the challenges in actually identifying, using the right language to approach the vulnerable groups, and how do we integrate them in programs, how do we integrate them in evaluations, taking into account these various factors. Since we had we had some questions to the whole panel, and there was at least this last one to Pedro, so maybe, do you want to go first, Dr. Kamali?
I think most of the questions are directed to
Okay.
Thank you, Heather. So the question on redistribution, all societies redistribute income through the tax and transfer systems. Examples of successful implementation of redistribution policies typically have to do with instances in which we look at the effects not only of transferring income that's collected by the government, but also the way in which it is spent on public services. And so I think what's happening in Egypt that Dr. Kamali alluded to is an example of efforts going in the right direction, of ensuring that the use of public resources are used in a way that benefits those in need. And part of it has to do with targeting, but that's not enough. And in fact, if I could also pose a question to Dr. Kamali, it's important also to generate support in society as a whole for this kind of programs and policies. And so how to navigate the political economy of redistribution is very complex and very different from country to country. Let me just add that countries that have implemented successful programs, for instance, Mexico, and I think I saw Gonzalo here, there he is. Maybe he can speak about some of the programs that are associated with conditional cash transfers. Brazil was another example. They played a role in reducing inequality in some of these countries, but the biggest contribution was actually through the labor market, was through enabling people to participate more in the labor market. That accounted for about 2/3 of the decrease in inequality in some of the Latin American countries in which inequality has gone down. So it's through redistribution, but not through the direct effect of taxes and spending, and more through the indirect effect through which public services, especially education, but also health, made in enabling more and more people to participate in the labor market. The question on ensuring participation, it's perhaps one of the reasons why we see that chart where people stay stuck at the bottom. It's just sometimes we don't have enough information to understand what are the challenges for the reasons you alluded to. Sometimes it's even fear of responding and engaging with the people doing the surveys. In fact, we know that even in quite developed countries, there are segments of the population that are completely excluded from being surveyed or being even part of census. An example in Europe is the Roma population, for instance, which is about 10 to 12 million people that are not part of the regular system of census, surveys. So it's not only in parts of Africa, it's really a pervasive problem that we need to take quite seriously if we are serious about meeting the challenge of leaving no one behind. Thank you.
Perhaps, in fact, I can just go along the line and ask each of you to sort of summarize your responses to the questions, and then we can bring the session to a close. So, Indran? Are evaluations not providing solutions?
I think a very quick point, and it links to the theme of this session, is we need to reflect on the unit of analysis. We tend to move quite quickly in aggregating a result, but not unpacking what the unit of analysis is. So you get global pictures, Pedro's spoken about it, the averages, and they do not actually point to the intra-regional inequality. So just a methodological issue.
Kamali?
Just to complement what Indran said, and we couldn't hear very well the question, but it's about the value of evaluation, if I understand clearly, and I think evaluation has really played that role of major accountability. But as Indran said, we need to move to evaluation considering the way we are now, where we don't really have the answers. Evaluation needs to move to actually addressing the implementation in understanding what's called implementation science. Evaluation also needs to actually start looking at the behavioral insights. You know, it's when we understand, when we're looking at issues of gender, you really need to get beyond just looking at structures and systems, you know, and looking at averages, to really look at what are the behaviors, what are the choices people are making. And that gets us more to looking at our main contribution, which is looking at process evaluation, formative evaluation, and what somebody calls developmental evaluation. And I think in doing that, we begin to really look at the realities of people, you know, and the philosophies that actually guide what they do, and the relational types of thinking they have, which might not be consistent with our own methods of seeing things. So I think how evaluation could make a role, as Indran said, not looking at just broad averages, but really looking into the box, you know, to actually play a role in clearly explaining what's happening, why it's happening, in what context, and for whom. And I think when we have that information, we can begin to then understand what is that result at the end that we're seeing. Thank you.
Okay, I don't have much to add, but and I couldn't hear the questions very clearly either, so I'm probably talking about something completely different. But my take on evaluation is really the fact that the evaluation has been far too much focused on individual interventions. We take an intervention, we take a project and we look at the logic model of that, and we look at the theory of change, how that particular project is doing. And if it does what it set out to do, so then we are happy. But the point is that everything takes place in a broader environment, and everything that we do has unintended or unanticipated consequences. So we have to take a broader look. We have to, what some of us have been calling an open theory of change. So we look into the system, we look into where is that, whether it's a project or a program or a policy or a strategy, operates and sees how does it interact with everything else. And from an environmental point of view, that indeed does mean that, okay, we can evaluate environmental projects and programs and policies and strategies and see how they relate to what human systems do, but vice versa also, because you take a school project, you take a health project, everything will have environmental implications, and you'll have to look into that. We, in the environmental sector, we had a long history of, treating people as an externality, and we were only concerned about biodiversity conservation and climate change and so on. Now we understand that you cannot separate these two aspects. So I really wish that evaluators on the other side of the fence who are concerned with inequality, poverty reduction, gender equality, whatever, economic development would also take into account the environmental dimensions.
Thank you very much to our panelists, to our audience, and to the people that have asked us a few questions. I think we're just going to wrap this up. I'm not going to make any attempt to try to summarize the very rich interventions of our colleagues here, so I will hand it back to our Master of Ceremonies.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for our panel. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be adjourning for a lunch break. We're going to be back after 1 hour and a half. Please be there. One more time, we want to clarify that Al-Daw View Room is now was moved to Al-Daw A, and that this is how it's going to be for the next sessions. Thank you very much, and we'll be back after 1 hour and a half.